Welcome to the Zach on Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Zach Hughes. Today's episode is entitled How to Make Priority Calls. So, what's the priority? If you are in a leadership role, there's a good chance that you get asked that question regularly. That question doesn't bother me. I enjoy making priority calls. I don't agonize over it at all. How do I do that? Well, that requires some explanation. I was just in a meeting earlier this week where the subject came up. I started to talk through my thought process and afterward decided to write it all down and share it with you on this podcast episode. Here it is. Prioritization matters. Prioritization is a decision. It's a decision to commit time, energy, and money toward a goal. There's an opportunity cost to every decision. When we decide to prioritize something, we implicitly deprioritize something else. We need to do this because our time and resources are finite. We'd love to do everything, but we can't, so we must choose what makes the most impact. Speaking of impact, I keep the 80-20 rule in mind. 80% of my results will come from 20% of my efforts. I can't control everything, but with my discretion, I try to make room for things that I believe have the highest chance of making that big, noteworthy impact. This is the stuff that will matter years from now. Prioritization questions. I like to ask questions to help me assess the situation. Here are some key questions. If we don't do it, do we get worse? If the answer is yes, I usually think of it as a pretty high priority. Operational issues, security, and compliance items all fall into this bucket. If we neglect these, we degrade over time. I want to improve. I can't afford to regress. If we don't do it, can we achieve our goals? I like to keep our eyes on where we are going as an organization. Some things help us meet our goals, and other things are just good ideas. There's nothing wrong with the latter, but if we're constrained, we should prioritize the strategy. What matters most to our customers? We are in the customer service business, but we don't always think that way. Letting customers influence our priority decisions is always wise. Is it ready now? Is it needed now? Sometimes there is an important thing to do, but the timing isn't right. Perhaps we're waiting for some other team to do their job first. Perhaps it just isn't needed yet. Are we excited about it? Why should you prioritize work that you are excited about? They may seem like superfluous criteria, but it's not. When inspiration strikes, you'll do a better job in less time. This maximizes your productivity. It's like riding a wave. Prioritization happens at 4 levels. Individual. We all manage schedules and decide what to work on and when. I wrote an entire article about how I manage my calendar. It's called The Art of Declining Meetings. You should check it out. I've got a link to it in the show notes. Team. When I managed a team, I had a top 10 list of team priorities. I updated it each week and discussed it at our team meetings. You may use a backlog to manage this. There are many ways to communicate and manage team priorities. Cross-team. This is hard. I'll come back to this. Organization. Most large organizations clearly communicate their top strategic priorities to all employees. Our CEO often discusses these at our town halls. These are great, but they're always very high level. Sometimes it's hard to connect day-to-day teamwork with these organizational priorities. If you can, you might have several different projects that all support that big priority, and you may struggle to prioritize among them. Cross-team prioritization. The stark reality is we do not work in isolation. Our teams are not completely autonomous. We must work together to get important work done. This is a tough nut to crack. I have my method, but before I get into it, I like to share a few ways that don't work. Number 1, central control. I used to work with a project management office that used a fancy algorithm to assign a priority score to every single project so they could be used to rank against each other for priority calls. This failed for 3 reasons. First, the priority rank process was onerous. No one wanted to do it. Number 2, you could game the system once you figured out how it worked. Number 3, it was a point-in-time priority assessment. It never changed over the life of the project or as the business environment changed. Another way is top control. You escalate every priority call to the top. This slows down everything and tends to incentivize politics. The top has limited time and attention to deal with these priority calls, and organizational productivity stagnates. Another way is survival of the fittest. Teams advocate for their priorities and duke it out. Sometimes fouls get called and sometimes they don't. The last way is committee. Some committees function as decision-making bodies for priority calls across teams. In my experience, this is usually a formality and is typically preceded and supported by other problem-solving methods. Negotiate priorities. I recommend that teams negotiate their cross-team priorities. This requires collaboration, relational skills, emotional intelligence, empathy, trust, and patience. When I use the term negotiate, I don't mean like a hostage situation, but rather a good faith, respectful discussion among colleagues. I encourage teams to think about their mutual customers and shared strategies. I encourage teams to be transparent with their interests and creative with their solutions. Whenever possible, this should take place among empowered leaders closest to the context. Escalate only when necessary. I'm very intentional with my use of the term negotiate. Some of my listeners are afraid to do that or they don't know how. I once was that way too. Then I learned. I wrote an article about my journey on learning how to negotiate. You can check out the link to it in the show notes. Check alignment. This is easy and a lot better than escalation. When you talk to your boss, tell her, I worked through this priority call. This is how I worked through it. I involved these people in the discussion. This is the decision I made. Does this make sense to you? Are we aligned? Your turn. Those are my tips. As you can tell, I care a lot about quality priority decisions. They matter, however, you won't always get it right. Be kind to yourself when you make mistakes. Be kind to others, especially when negotiating cross-team priorities. This is hard work, but you are up for the challenge. That's all for this week's episode of the Zach on Leadership Podcast. Thanks for listening.